Buenas tardes. Lamentablemente es difícil competir en estas fechas del año con las compras navideñas y las cenas de empresa y lamentablemente pues hay pocos pero buenos.
With Christmas shopping and everything else going on these days, so we don't have a lot of people, but of course in these kinds of events, what matters really, of course, is the streaming, because there's a lot of Casa Árabe followers who watch our events on the internet, and therefore it makes sense to go ahead and hold them, even if there's nobody physically in the room. And we're organizing this together with the Elcano Foundation, with whom we have a long working relationship, to present the results of the Human Development Report for 2016, published by the United Nations Programme for Development, and with its coordinators and experts. Unfortunately, at the last minute, we were told that Mr. Adel Abdelatif, who's the main strategic advisor of the regional office for the Arab states at UNDP, could not come, and unfortunately he will be missed. But we do have Mrs. Nasrin Salki, whom we'd like to thank for being here with us today, who is an associate professor at the Department of Economics of the American University of Beirut, which is, as you know, an extremely prestigious university, not just in the Middle East, but of course globally. And so I'm going to give the floor, without any further ado, to Mr. Amira Fernandez, who is main advisor for the Mediterranean and the Arab world of the Real Instituto Elcano. Thank you, Director, and good evening. Everyone, delighted to be back in Casa Árabe, and also delighted to be here with Nasrim and Olivia to speak about a topic which we have been studying and following very closely at the Real Instituto Elcano in partnership with Casa Árabe in the past, which is the topic of human development in the Arab world and how much is changing in this region, which neighbors Spain and which is experiencing a process of tremendous change and uncertainty. In the past, we presented the results on human development of 2004 and 2005. We also attended the presentation here in Casa Árabe of the 2009 report, and the background to this series of reports is an analysis of the deficits that prevent a greater level of human development in the Arab region, in the 22 member countries of the Arab League, where human development rates are relatively low, particularly in terms of the potential of the region, given its health, its wealth, its potential, its human capital, and its geographic location and its links with the rest of the world. Deficits which initially, when these reports were first published, were essentially three: freedoms in the broader sense, also deficit in knowledge, its generation, dissemination, and also one of the deficits still has to do with the lack of empowerment of women in the Arab region. And of course, the second to last report published by UNDP included the human security deficit, which is, of course, a broader concept than the traditional security concept, because human security includes the safety of the habitat and living conditions and many other factors. And so today we are here to present a very broad, very rich, very detailed report focused on youth. And this is where I would like to quickly describe the context before Professor Sri Salti presents the main conclusions and the main messages of the UNDP report. And the context is that of a very youthful population. It's really, if we look at the different regions in the world, the Arab region is one of the youngest regions in the world, with very numerous youthful population proportionally, and also with a demographic structure and growth rates and life expectancies and average or mean ages that are really striking and very different from the global average. We're talking about populations in the Arab countries which currently have 2/3 of their population under 30, which may sound just like a number or a percentage, but actually has tremendous implications. If we consider that about 2/3 of the Arab population is under 30, that means that these are populations of around 360 million people, of which about 240 were born after 1987. And that, of course, in terms of the demographic structure and for the social needs and public services and social peace in the region, has tremendous implications. Countries which have populations with mean ages, in some cases of 22, 23, in some cases 24, or even lower mean age below, at that level, means that these are demographic pyramids with very broad bases, with very specific needs for the younger population segments, as well as the general needs of the population as a whole. And also, we were able to see in 2011 that there was concern because something was changing in the Arab countries. There was a demand for change in various areas, in some cases perhaps in rather a disorganized fashion, but that demand for change and transformation was present then, is still present there today amongst those populations which are still extremely young, where they have not seen any response to a good number of their social, economic demands, also demands in terms of the governance in their countries and their desire to be represented and taken into account in decision making and in the distribution of resources and in access to opportunities. As a result, of course, we have to think about the trends and the current context in the countries internally, but also the geopolitical context of the region, the Arab region as a whole, with its very complex neighbors in the Middle East and in the Maghreb. And we find societies that are not quite able to offer or generate sufficient opportunities for these youthful populations so that they can have opportunities to develop and to establish a career. The educational systems have significant deficits in terms of resources, but also structures, plannings, approaches. And also these are societies that are not offering opportunities because of a series of restrictions or limitations, politically because of the institutional dysfunctions of these states. They are also unable to create sufficient jobs or allow the creation of sufficient jobs in the private sector, and not enough entrepreneurial opportunities for young people who have projects, who want to participate actively in the economies of their countries and also to contribute positively to the development of their societies. And that is connected to things like authoritarian regimes, which are widespread in the region in different ways and at different levels. And it's also, of course, connected to corruption in the management of public affairs, in the political systems, with the obstacles and the interference of the executive power, which has a dominant control over the rest of the systems. Of course, then there's social and cultural elements that are being used in order to maintain that control and that pressure over the population, to prevent more openness, to prevent change in the way these countries are governed, and also resorting, of course, to threats, which real or perceived threats coming from the outside world. Of course, these demands became very visible in 2011. There was a turning point, but they're still present in spite of the differences in the different Arab countries and within each of the countries. So these demands still exist. There's social activism of different types, civil society organizations, associations, also in the web, but in the more extreme forms of this discontent and this frustration, which gives rise to radicalization with religious or other types of anti-system movements because of this frustration and the anxiety generated by the lifestyles and the absence of opportunities. Exclusion is an extremely important factor affecting youth and women and minorities. The exclusion of those who are not in the immediate circles of power, political power, economic power, control, frequently, depending on the country, things very strictly, preventing a greater participation, preventing a more diverse makeup of decision-making mechanisms, and also preventing diversity in coexistence in complex societies where there's great diversity, not just of age groups, but also of religious and ethnic minorities. And in the last years, to finish the context that we have been experiencing, particularly in the Middle East, has been increasing chaos and states being brought into question, states which haven't been around that long, since the independence movement of the 1920s onwards, states that are nevertheless showing signs of wear and dysfunction and are unable to respond to the demands or meet the expectations that had been raised in their population, with development models that have proven to have tremendous limitations, with social and economic conditions that meant that large parts of the population live in poverty and with tremendous insecurity about the future and with tremendous fears, particularly where they fear losing what has been gained, what has been achieved since independence, and particularly this youth, which is increasingly disconnected from these authoritarian regimes that are often controlled by older generations that are very far removed from the concerns and demands of these younger age groups, with other ways of communicating and looking at the world and looking at what's happening elsewhere in the world. And this disconnect is something that has a lot to do with access to education, in spite of its deficits, but also new technologies which enable contact with the outside world, to see what's happening in other countries, to compare the way they live with the way other societies live, which brings them to question why they don't have these opportunities that they see exist elsewhere in their own countries. And these frustrations are still there. The numbers, the statistics constantly remind us that it's not just that the Arab countries have been unable to absorb the new cohorts that are reaching the labor market, but also that the number of unemployed or underemployed continues to grow. The lack of opportunities and illegal and also political framework that will enable better connections with the rest of the global economies is also an obstacle to development. And as a result, to finish, there is a widespread feeling of lack of empowerment, frustration, and also a feeling of being ignored by their governments, by systems that are not meeting their expectations. And the question is whether a return to more authoritarian regimes in some Arab countries where there were attempts to overthrow those forms of government and who are now returning to a more robust authoritarian regime, the question is that whether this repression and this blocking of modes of expression might manage to stabilize the conditions and allow slightly more significant economic growth, or on the contrary, this attempt to go back to the policies of the past, this new repressive regimes might not give rise to even more unrest and therefore a new wave of social unrest, which, if it happened, depending on the context, might give rise to a reaction on the part of those who are afraid of losing power and the control of the resources that they are managing freely. And that's it for me, and I'm sure that Professor Nasreen Salti will be giving us a lot more information about the content of the report and all its data. Thank you.
Por mi parte, antes de presentar a la profesora Nasreen,
Actually, before we introduce Professor Nasreen Salti, let me just give you a bit of color on the economic aspects of this uncertain context of the region in general. The Arab economies in the last years have been directly impacted by global downturn, conflicts in the region, and also the fall in oil prices. So a whole set of factors that have put these economies in a very difficult position, as well as in the social and political, as we've just heard. So this is a point when oil exporting countries have had negative growth rates, something that was very unusual given all the decades since the oil prices boomed. And there's been some recovery this year, and we're still waiting to see whether the Libyan economy will recover, but the prospects are still negative, and it's not been offset by more growth in the oil importing countries, whose energy bill might have been cheaper, but who have nevertheless only had an average of 2.6% GDP growth in 2016, less than in 2015, when it was about 3%. So in summary, the figures for the region overall were GDP growth 3%, again slightly lower than in 2015, and the forecasts predict that this year the region as a whole will only grow about 2%, and it's expected that this will continue in 2018, next year, with only 2.9% growth, since no improvements are expected in oil prices nor in the ongoing conflicts in the region, which are having a very negative impact on the economies of these countries. So the context is really very difficult, but actually a lot more complex than what GDP growth figures show. Beyond variables like GDP growth, which are just macroeconomic parameters, aggregates of what happens in a country's economy. For decades now, the Human Development Index has been the more comprehensive indicator to assess development as a whole in a country. The Human Development Index considers not just GDP metrics, but also a whole range of other parameters, which include not just income, but also how that wealth is distributed and used and impacts various indicators around inequality, poverty, birth rates, life expectancy, and other parameters which have to do with quality of life and persons' ability to choose their own life path and to participate actively. And that's why we have been, in the last few years, looking at not just the Arab Human Development Index for the Arab countries, but also the reports presented and published by the UNDP on Arab human development. And in the latest report, which we're presenting today, which was published just a year ago, and it's taken actually 8 years to do. The one before that was published in 2009, and we presented it here in 2010, also in partnership with the Real Instituto Elcano. And it's a report which has been very difficult to collate at a time when there have been profound changes and transformations in the whole region, as we will also hear from Professor Salti. It's a period in which we have seen that youth have played a tremendous role as active participants or catalysts of the profound changes that have happened in the last few years because of the tremendous disenfranchisement they experience both financially and politically in these countries. And it's really the main focus of the report, and so we thought it was important to present the results here and to discuss them, because even though there's been decades of attempts of economic reforms and different development models and economic growth strategies, still an aspect which has not been corrected, nor since the revolutions or counter-revolutions or the different changes, nor the downturn, nor the different proposals that have been attempted have given any sort of response to these demands, which in the future will have an impact one way or another. And it's definitely a tremendously important issue that's going to have enormous consequences for the future. And so in that sense, the Arab Human Development Report 2016 calls upon the Arab states to invest in their youth, to not ignore them, as Hakan was saying, to empower them and give them the ability to participate in the development of their countries. Turning their models towards them and towards a more active participation of their youth. Populations, as we've heard, are predominantly young in these countries, and the fact that most of the population, half, two-thirds of the population are under 30, has been considered in the literature as an opportunity for development, but you have to take advantage of that opportunity, and you have to find a way to channel the needs and expectations of this young population. I'm not going to give you any figures on unemployment because I'm sure Nasreen will, but certainly unemployment in the Arab world is one of the biggest issues. The region overall has the highest unemployment rates, youth unemployment rates in the world, double the global average. So youth unemployment only 29.7%, and the global average is 14%. So the figures are particularly serious, and the impact is particularly serious for women, who also have the lowest employment rates in the world. And the problem, as we said, is that nothing really is being done to change this, so it can only get worse between now and 2030. 2019, when the 90 million jobs that the region will require are to be created. It's also a message for political leaders and the youth itself, with some figures about political participation, the expectations of young people on various aspects, identity, religion. It's a really comprehensive and complex report, very extensive, and it covers a series of surveys that have been done, and focus groups with Arab youth, in which they have been asked what issues they believe their countries should prioritize, and they have selected 5, which should be in order of importance: education system, better employment opportunities, honest government, affordable nutritional food, and better public services. So these are the priorities identified by young Arabs according to the UNDP report 2016. And the report
El informe destaca también que hubo un periodo de avance de 1980 a 2010.
There was some progress between 1980 and 2010 when the Human Development Indexes rose in the Arab countries, with significant progress achieved thanks to improvements in healthcare and education, but that nevertheless in the last few years in general there has been stagnation. From 2010 the indexes have actually worsened, growth has come to a halt, and inequality has increased most significantly in the Arab countries. And inequality, of course, has an impact on education and income, as well as differences between one region and another, the rural areas and the urban areas, which is also one of the aspects that was identified since the Arab risings of 2012, pointing at some of the problems that might create greater tension and imbalances in the region. Don't want to take up any more of your time. I'm going to give the floor to Nisreen, who's she's an expert in inequality and poverty. Nisreen Salti. Let me just pull out her CV. Associate professor at the Department of Economics, American University of Beirut, works on development economics, political economics, and she has focused her research specifically on inequality, particularly in terms of resources, access, and outcomes, particular focus on health. Her studies on inequality, she's particularly interested in marginalized communities and refugees, and she was part of the central group of experts that has produced this report that we're presenting today, the Arab Human Development Report 2016, but has also published in numerous referenced publications and peer-reviewed publications, including Who's Being Left Behind, Why Sustainable Development Goals Failed, and another on natural resources, wealth, risk of poverty, which is the topic I just was referring to, about those communities that are being left out of development and the problem of the distribution of wealth. She has a PhD in economics, a master's in public affairs from Princeton University, where she was research assistant, and that's before her current job. So I'm just going to give her the floor so she can go through a summary of the report and share with us some of the lessons learned and the challenges that they have faced when working on the report. Thank you.
So, thank you everybody for this invitation. I'd like to thank Casa Árabe for a very warm welcome, and very happy to be the person of all of the big team involved in the report to be here sharing some of the findings with you. I want to thank Haytham for the context that was very comprehensive and should help us go through what I have to say. And I'd like to thank Olivia for the introduction. Again, very, very humbling. A few things. I'm sorry this is not in Spanish, but it's for everyone's benefit, trust me. But I also want to signal to the interpreter that if I speak too fast, just wave or something, because I have a tendency. This is the first country I go to where I find that I don't speak fast, but I do have a tendency to speak fast. Yeah. So just signal if you need me to slow down. So the report was sort of 2 years in the making and a much long, well, equally long time in the publication, but it's available. It's online. The executive summary is about to get translated, I've been told. So hopefully a lot of what I missed today in the presentation is accessible, and hopefully you can find. But one of the things about this report in particular that we tried to provide that's slightly different from previous iterations of the report is that some of the resources in the report are sort of more continuous than the publication itself from the 2016 November launch. Some of these which I think both Haitham and Olivier have alluded to, have been focus groups with youth from the region where the team at the Regional Bureau of Arab States at UNDP has tried to continue conversation with these youth to try to keep track of developments, keep track of where the salient questions that were written up in this report are today after the report's already printed and there's very little updating that we can do. Another aspect that is, in some sense, more in real time is something I will also discuss, but which, again, I don't show in this presentation. It's online. It's on the website, and it gets much more updated than any of the information that we've actually included in the print version. So what I'll start with tonight is some background statistics on who put this together, why, how. And then some general remarks on the findings from the report on development in the Arab region in general, and then on the youth in particular. And the way I thought I would summarize the very, very large report to you in the limited time that we have is maybe some of the more striking features. Some statistics or findings where we found that the region, the Arab world, compared to other regions, sticks out, is really an exception. Or alternatively, findings that go against the grain, findings that are counter to most expectations, or that actually dispel some of the myths that we have about the region and about youth in the region. The other findings that I also have included here are where the region, because this focuses on the youth, where those findings where that we found that the youth are most different from their parents, where intergenerational change is fastest or most prominent. So this is what we've decided to include, what I've decided to include in this relatively short summary of the content. The content is much, much more comprehensive, but a lot of it is updating standard figures on development and on achievements and outcomes with a specific focus on those statistics that concern the youth. I will close with a couple of things. Some of the main policy takeaways, although that's always a very difficult thing to come up with, or it's either empty or difficult, so policy recommendations, they're either very obvious even before we write the report, or they're, those that come out of the report are almost impossible, but we'll talk about that. And then finally, given that it's been over a year since a lot of the information that was in the report is published, what I thought I'd do is, given everything that's happened in this year, if the authors were to sit together again and maybe talk about an update or talk about an epilogue or maybe think about the same issues that we thought about 2-3 years ago, what are the main things that we would correct or change our focus on? So that's what I call hindsight at the very end of the presentation. So very quickly on the background statistics of who's behind this. Those people that were very devoted to the report are about 35 of us. Some of them actually, we're very proud of this, but some of them were youth. Some of them some of us wished we were youth, but the rest were actually youth. And so it's really 7 original chapters and then 1 chapter which is the introduction chapter that sort of is an umbrella to all the others. Authors from very different countries, co-authors as well, background papers, again from very different countries, a data analyst and a research associate, and these were actually the youth. Some of the youth. The Regional Bureau of Arab States of UNDP made available to us 4 assigned researchers as well, which we acknowledge in the report. And then, of course, a whole team of editors and reviewers and translators and designers and web experts. In particular, because we did use a lot of raw data, Olivia already alluded to this. So standard surveys that are out there, Gallup World Poll Survey, except that we used the whole World Poll Survey, so with over 2 million observations in this poll. The World Values Surveys, which don't include all the Arab world, but include a number of countries. The School to Work Transition Surveys, the Country Household Surveys as well, where they were made available to us. And this Waqti is one of the ways in which we try to make this report more long-lasting, or some of the outcomes of the report still contemporary and still relevant. Because what we did is we developed, and that's why we had these developers and web experts, developed an app that helps us administer these time use surveys, which are quite standard and quite widespread, but have not really been implemented in the Arab world. So we implemented these time use surveys using a cell phone app across 18 Arab capitals. And this, the development of this was during the writing of the report. This app was not launched until the report was already written. So the findings are not, a lot of the findings are not included in the report, but the findings keep getting posted on the website. So the website is still alive in many ways, even after the report's printed. And that's something I definitely invite you to consult. And then, of course, research software to help us with a mountain of information. General findings on development, and this will resonate with what Haytham and Olivia have just said. Some positive messages, some good accomplishments, an increase in educational enrollment, especially among women over the last 15 years, a decrease in extreme poverty and in malnutrition and food insecurity, again, over the last 15 years, and a general increase in health-adjusted life expectancy. But this is if we take a very long-term perspective. This is, we think, very early 2000 until today. So from even before the first Arab Human Development Report until today. On the less positive side, the negative side, what we see, again in the same period, is a sharp rise in armed conflict, militarization, violence, and forced displacement, which tend to go together. Low economic growth, again echoing what Olivia has already warned us about, slow job creation. Both Haytham and Olivia spoke about this. A rise in the cost of living, which we thought was especially pertinent to some of the transformations relating to youth and relating to transitioning from youth to your 30s, basically. And then the degradation of social, physical, and environmental capital, a lot of it linked to the rise of conflict and the forced displacement, some of it linked to the slow job creation and the rising cost of living. And of course, these government budgets that are under severe stress, partly because of declining oil revenues, which, yes, mean the oil exporting states are in financial duress, but also the oil importing states of the region typically are the labor exporting states to the oil exporting states, so that remittances follow oil prices very, very closely in the region, and the drop in oil price basically spreads across both the oil producers and the oil importers in the region because they are linked through this labor market interdependence. So a few graphics just to show, just to drive some of the extremities of the region home. If we look at the period between 2000 and 2003, and we count the countries which witnessed conflict or political violence, we enumerate 4. So serious conflict or political violence. And again, in the report, we define this much more systematically and specifically. in the period 2010 to 2015, so slightly longer period, but not so long, 5 years, look at that list. I mean, it's almost every single country in the region has witnessed either conflict, war, or political violence. And then the chart on the right is a very stark portrait of how the region is quite polarized and quite exceptional, doesn't resemble other regions in the world on certain metrics. So it's home, the Arab world is home to 5.2% of humanity. So relatively small in terms of population or demographic weight. It's 11% of all countries, the 22 countries of the Arab world. But it had, since the end of World War II until 2014, so these 5% of us witnessed 17.6% of all conflict. So way more than our demographic share of conflict. In that period, in the post-World War II until 2014 period, similarly, the battle-related deaths, so the number of deaths per linked to conflict, 27.7 of all global battle-related deaths between World War II, the end of World War II, and 2014 happened in the Arab world. Now, 2014 happens, and suddenly, so the share of violence increases tremendously. The column with 45%, the sort of middle column in this chart, shows that 45% of all terrorist attacks happened in the Arab world, where only 5% of us exist. 47% of the world's internally displaced people are in the Arab world. And 57% of refugees in the world are in the Arab world. And what's interesting about the Arab world, it's both a source and a host of refugees. So it has it's the highest producer of refugees and the highest receiver of refugees at the same time, right? So it's these displacements of people, but also internal displacement that's massive on a massive scale. Now, one of the things I already mentioned in the previous slide, 65% is how much higher spending on military expenditures is in the Arab states versus the world average. So on average, the Arab states spend 65% more on the military than the world spends, which is sizable, and which, of course, goes hand in hand with all the other lurid outcomes that we're seeing here. And then finally, now in 2014, the share of battle-related deaths that happened in the Arab world is almost 70%. So of every 100 people that died in battle, 70 were in the Arab world in 2014. These are now general trends, again, some of which I mentioned in the slide. I'm just showing you some of the visuals. And the first slide basically tracks the Human Development Index, which combines 3 metrics of development: GDP growth, literacy, so educational outcomes in general, and health through life expectancy. So what this graph, the one to your left, portrays is how has this index changed, the growth rate of that index, which represents these 3 metrics of development, in various regions of the world. And you'll see that there's no consistent pattern in any given region between the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s in what's happening to that index. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it growing at a faster rate? Is it growing at a slower rate? Except the only systematic trend is in the middle group, which has this downward sloping arrow. That's the Arab world, where between the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, yes, I said there were positive outcomes, right? We have better life expectancy. We have more enrollment in schools. We have almost eradicated extreme poverty before the Yemen conflict. So we are doing better. It's just that the rate of progress is slowing down systematically, precipitously, over the 3 years. whereas it's not slowing down globally. It's not slowing down for every region of the world, just in the Arab world. On the right-hand side is a graphic that actually represents the cost of living, which again, we think is especially relevant for the youth because that is strictly linked to your transition into the next phase of your life. And so on the leftmost bar, what we show is the number of years of average income needed to afford a house. So housing prices expressed in terms of how many years of salaries, average incomes, average salaries. And in OECD countries, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 years of salary that can afford you the average house. And only in 2 Arab countries that we have data for is it more affordable to be able to buy a house. That's in Bahrain and the UAE, but in Iraq, it's slightly more expensive, or it costs a bit more in terms of your income to buy a house than in OECD countries. And then Syria, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria, countries that we don't necessarily associate with very high cost of living, it is extremely straining for people in these countries to be able to afford housing. And this is new. And this is something that we think is not, historical. This is a new trend. What about the focus on youth, right? That was the point of the report. That was our interest in the report, and it was very much linked to the uprisings and the demonstrations that happened in 2011. The reason that the team at the Regional Bureau of Arab States came to us and said, let's think of a new Arab Human Development report was precisely because of the rapid and completely unexpected transformations that were happening in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya, the rest of the world. So the Youth Bulge, right? So what did we learn about the youth? These impressions that we already had, that the report only confirmed, but maybe updated and specified. So my 2 colleagues here were talking about 2/3 of the population being below 30. Yes, absolutely. And 1/3 of the population is between 15 and 30, which we're calling youth. That's going to be our focus. So we actually don't include children in the report, where it's not the focus. It's included in the national statistics, but not the focus. Of course, all that Haytham and Olivia have pointed out is that 10 years from now, we're going to be in even more of a deeper situation of a youth bulge because they will have come of age and they will have entered the labor force and started to demand housing and family life, etc. So about 100 million people in that age group that we're looking at. So enrollment 3 times higher in secondary and tertiary education between 1970 and 2003. So huge improvements in enrollment, and we see that in the data still. But we notice, and this is a refinement of statistics that were less common, there's lower enrollment in science, technology, engineering, and math, in what we call STEM specializations, lower than the rest of the world. And there's a lot of research today in labor economics and education economics that shows us, in development economics, that shows us that these specializations very often linked to higher labor market outcomes. And so if we're trying to project ourselves into the future, there should be some concern or some worry that we lag behind the rest of the world on these labor market credentials in terms of specialization in these fields, STEM. 30% unemployed among the youth, the highest in the world, again echoing what Olivia said just a minute ago. Lowest labor force participation rate of women and also of young women. So unfortunately, it's been true of women in general, but the new generation does not show improvement on the labor market participation rate compared to men, whereas for men, it's comparable to the rest of the world. So it's not a labor market general issue that's specific to the Arab world. It's very, very much a gender issue related to women in the Arab world. With the cost of living, with the low labor force participation, and with the unemployment comes delayed marriage, delayed autonomy, and delayed family formation. All of which are going to mean, in sort of more refined ramifications, things like limit on political involvement And so exactly what Haytham was alarming us about, it's very difficult for the youth to stand up to these structures, stand up to the representatives, stand up to these political dynamics and forces when they're barely able to become autonomous from their parents, or start a life, or start a family life, or so enter the labor market. Persistent discrimination against women even outside of the labor market, so this is in terms of reproductive rights, in terms of social status. It goes hand in hand with the labor market outcomes. High emigration rates, right? So a lot of people are leaving the region. The youth are leaving the region, especially the university graduates. And risk factors like traffic accidents, tobacco, so risky behavior, and wars are much higher causes of death in the region, death of youth in the region than elsewhere in the world. So we have very, very high rates of tobacco consumption, traffic accidents, and wars. And if we looked at the causes of death elsewhere in the world, we find that the Arab world is very different than the rest of the world on this metric, on this statistic, which again is quite, it's something we knew about adults, and now we're confirming about youth, and it is alarming. What are some of the myths that we found evidence against in this report? So one of them is that increasing the employability of graduates and the private supply of jobs is enough to curb unemployment. So there's been a lot of talk of create jobs, job creation. We've had a low job creating growth. So when GDP per capita has grown, when these economies have improved, it's come without the creation of new jobs. And there's been a lot of that talk. What we found is it's not enough to create jobs. And in fact, this gets confirmed when we track the labor market outcomes of refugees who actually managed to find jobs. So it's not about jobs. It's about the right kinds of jobs, right? So creating jobs alone is not going to solve our unemployment issues. Economic reforms that reduce the size of the public sector should be at the core of any reform package. This, again, is something that is a refrain that we hear a lot from multinational organizations, from aid, from other governments sometimes. But we found that, again, it may have a lot of benefits, but it should not be the focus of our reform. And part of it, part of the complexity here, is that public sector employment, historically in the Arab world, has been one of the #1 forms of employment for women. So if we're going to crack down and try to reduce public sector employment, we know, but culturally, socially, economically, it's been the more attractive choice for women. If we dissolve these jobs in order to replace them with private sector jobs that women are not going to take, we're going to find ourselves with another problem, which is already there, but it's just going to get aggravated, which is that women do not enter the labor force because the options out there for women are actually quite underwhelming. Another myth, the vast majority of young Arabs are prone to radicalization and extremism. Our opinion polls, our time use surveys, our focus groups, our analysis of Gallup and World Values Survey show that on these issues, on issues of radicalization, extremism, they resemble the youth of anywhere else in the world. Not on every issue, but on issues of radicalization, extremism, they are just like 15 to 29-year-olds in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in East Asia, etc. Another myth that, again, our report really spoke against, many young Arabs have become apathetic after the failure of political change. The degree of involvement that we see, the degree of dynamism and initiative that we found in the focus groups, in the opinion polls, in the surveys, in the transition to work survey, etc., is, again, quite impressive and doesn't make the Arab world actually stick out on this in any way. And there are specific chapters that I can invite you to read in the discussion if some of these issues are closer to your hearts. Young migrants originating from Arab countries constitute a major threat to developed economies. Again, we have a whole chapter on migration to OECD countries, and a lot of the labor market statistics on that show no evidence of that in particular. And then finally, post-conflict recovery in the region, especially in youth-related sectors, should be an easy path. I mean, there's already been talk about Syria and the post-conflict, and people get very excited about how easy it's going to be to drive all the refugees back home from Lebanon to Syria. But the reality on the ground is so different. And the cessation of violence is not the end of conflict, and it certainly is not the beginning of recovery. And so that's something, especially for youth-related sectors who have just lost critical years of their lives, is going to be much more arduous than a lot of what we read in the press. So what are some of our new messages, different from previous iterations of this Arab Human Development Report? Something that, both people who spoke before me actually mentioned: economic inequality and inequality of opportunity, especially in things like access to education, as Haytham said, access to healthcare, are becoming crucial problems in the region. And these are things that, until recently, statistics showed to be not especially grave in the region. Again, you say inequality and people immediately think Brazil. People immediately think Central America, or they think South Africa. Among OECD countries, you immediately think the US. Well, we find that actually these measures of inequality of opportunity in the Arab world far exceed what we see in these other regions of the world. And that's been something that we sort of has not been the focus of much research. It's becoming the focus of research. Life dissatisfaction among Arab youth is the highest in the world. And it goes beyond a lack of access to jobs. So that's not the main reason. Well, that's certainly a primary reason, but it's not the only reason. So don't just adjust your labor market. These are much more complex individuals than you think, and they're not just people looking to have an income. There's an overwhelming majority of youth that rejects terrorism and radicalization. Overwhelming, truly, in the 99% or 95% is what we find. Yet, and this is where there's some differences from youth in the rest of the world. When we compare social values among the youth in the Arab world and elsewhere, we do find that they tend to be more patriarchal, less tolerant towards people of different cultures or religion than young people in other middle-income countries, in other countries that have similar GDP per capita. But neither extremist and radical, nor pro-radicalization or terrorism. More new messages, and then I'll show you graphics of some of these messages, and then we'll close. Arab countries actually receive more migrants than they send out. So we've talked about internally displaced populations, which are highest in the Arab world. We've talked about refugees, which are also highest in the Arab world. But a third form is actually migrant workers, which per capita are also highest in some Arab countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council, where in some extreme cases, Qatar, migrant workers are about 80% of residents. And the national population of nationals is around 20%. Young women are not necessarily well represented in the labor force, but in political and social mobilization, they are actually quite active. Much more so than the popular press leads us to believe. There's a very high rate of connectivity and growing rate of connectivity. And new news sources, again, something that Haytham alluded to, that might change the way that some of these archaic, rigid state structures are having to deal with their young populations. The youth are more self-expressive and more civically engaged, again, based on our interactions with them, based on our data, based on our research, and our review of other people's research. Conflicts have wide-ranging intergenerational impacts on human capital formation. So again, hopefully conflicts will subside. This generation of youth that we looked at will not fully recover. They've already lost something that's going to take them years to gain. And hopefully all we'll be doing is sparing the next generation. But the current generation of youth is already suffering, is going to suffer a long-run damage from this current conflict. Yet, and this is linked to the self-expression, linked to the civic engagement and the political mobilization, we found that youth under conflict show higher levels of civic participation and altruism. Some of these vignettes are, again, on the website, and I do invite you to read them because some of them are quite touching about the sorts of organization that happens under conflict among very, very active youth. So some of the figures behind this, I said growing inequality. The top blue line is the evolution of the richest 10% of incomes in the Arab states between 2008 and 2012. So it may actually be relatively constant. There's not that the share of the level of income of the top 10% is relatively stagnant. The next line from above is the richest fragment of the population, 10%, in other middle-income countries. So the richest in the Arab world are richer than the richest in other middle-income countries. And then the two lines below are the poorest in the Arab world, in blue and with triangles. And then the bottom line is the poorest in middle-income countries. So it's true that the poorest in the Arab world are also doing better off than the poorest in other middle-income countries. But the distance, right, the gap between rich and poor is larger and growing in the Arab world. And so that's one of the things that, doesn't bode very well for the coming few years. Inequality of opportunity, I mentioned that. Here is a very crude measure of how these things persist over generations. So what we look at for a series of these countries, a subset of countries in the Arab world, is the fraction of people who ever attended school and the fraction of youth who reached a secondary education in the two panels, left and right. And we divide our samples into the most vulnerable according to their parents' socioeconomic status, and the most advantaged, again, according to their parents' socioeconomic status. And ideally, what we want to see is universal school enrollment. Ideally, what we want to see is very minor differences in educational attainment and educational enrollment for boys and girls across these two family backgrounds. Unfortunately, that's not what we see. Yes, we have almost universal primary school enrollment for boys and girls for the most advantaged, but we don't have that at all for the more vulnerable. And yes, we have an impressive share of boys and girls reaching secondary schooling among the most advantaged, but we're very far behind. I mean, the statistics for Iraq, and of course secondary school means we're looking at a slightly older generation. This is part of what we mean when we say the effects of conflict are so long-lasting. The labor market outcomes of the generation where 8% of boys from less advantaged families reach secondary school is a lifetime of labor market loss. And then presumably a second generation of that as well. Connectivity, I talked about that, so let's look at some of the figures. On the left side is mobile cellular subscriptions per 100 residents or inhabitants. The top line is the average over time, 2005 to 2015, for developed countries. And just below that is Arab states, in gray with squares. In gray with triangles is the world average. So you'll see that the Arab states started below the world average in 2005 and now are comfortably above the world average in terms of cell phones per person or per 100 people. And then the bottom line is the developing world. And then on the right panel, what I show is the people connected to the internet. Again, the top line being developed countries, the share of residents with internet connections, rising steadily, right, in the developed world, but also rising in the world. That's the triangles. The Arab world does below the world average, is worse than the world average, but it's rising at the same rate. It's not falling behind. And so we're keeping up, and then developing countries as well. So this rising connectivity, that's going to mean a very different form of engagement with the youth. And finally, I've talked about how some of the opinions of the youth are very similar to what we find in youth in other parts of the world. The biggest obstacle facing the Middle East. We asked the young people in our surveys to identify the biggest obstacle facing the Middle East. And 37% in 2014 said the rise of the Islamic State, ISIS. 32% said the threat of terrorism. And then came unemployment. Even though unemployment is affecting them more than the youth elsewhere in the world, they have the highest rate of youth unemployment in the world, you'll see that their priorities, their main fears, are very similar to the fears of others of their peers in other regions of the world. So what are the main policy takeaways from all of this? Peace and security is going to be the #1 ingredient, right? If we do everything else but we still have the same level of conflict, all is lost. But involve the youth. They've already been shown tremendous initiative and resources during conflict. So they're very likely to show equally impressive abilities after conflict, to get us out of conflict. Expanding capabilities and opportunities, not just jobs. So part of this is affordable housing. Part of this is encouraging female labor force participation through structural changes that we know might lead to more participation by women, adequate health care and education. One suggestion is universal health coverage, which does not exist right now in the Arab world. And the opportunities, the flip side of what we hope to enhance, is decent jobs and an open space for civic engagement. A lot of the times that civic engagement is having to happen in subversive spaces or outside of the normal space. Young people as partners and not just as spectators. So these are the main messages. Now, in the 2 years that have intervened, what have we as authors of this report learned that would have maybe led us to change or add a chapter with a slightly different focus? One of the most striking things that we've learned more and more about after the report was released is the extent of inequality in the region. Again, this is a region that doesn't get a lot of bad press for inequality, not as much as the iconic Brazil and the iconic South Africa, all of which are always stated as examples of extreme polarization of income distributions. Well, recent research on the Arab world, because it's using more updated data, because it's using smarter data, will show you here's the share of the top 10% in various regions of the world. Top 10% income earners, their share of total income. So the top 10% in the Middle East, this is not the whole Arab world, but this is the Middle East, is over 60% of national income. And that is on par with South Africa. That is worse than Brazil. So in Brazil, the top 10% earn somewhere around 55% of national income. And it's certainly worse than the US, definitely worse than Western Europe, about, drastically worse than Western Europe. So we are now the most unequal part of the world. And we need to start coming to terms with that and dealing with that and putting that in the forefront. And that's something that the report talks about, but not to this extent. And this is something that has come to light. This is research from this year, 2017. It's come to light much more recently in terms of these actual measures, documented evidence. The other thing, and that's a lot more recent, is we've tried to use youth we've embraced that concept, we've embraced that theme as we've discussed because of the Arab uprisings and because of the overwhelming youth representation and youth activism and youth connectivity and youth transformations happening on Arab streets and on Arab plazas and centers and squares in 2011 onwards. One of the dangers has been that this category of youth is used, has become used by the same state structures, by the same rigid institutions in a manipulative way. And so what I'll close with is this very recent quote from last month from an analyst, this is in the Washington Post, the analyst talking about current changes in Saudi Arabia. So the younger generation of rulers have created the illusion of a new Saudi Arabia, one defined by youth, right? This is the center of what the reforms have been about in Saudi Arabia. Moderation, liberalization, it's the modern Saudi, it's the liberal, so women are going to be able to drive and work, and robots can get passports. But far from embodying a break from the traditional Saudi rule, the new generation of rulers have simply doubled down on the tried and tested approaches to modern Saudi statecraft. We know how Saudi statecraft works. It's the same techniques. It's just now done in the name of youth. And so we worry about this category, and it's something that I think in the report we were not very cognizant of or careful of, the danger of making that category the center and then having that category rhetorically be co-opted for purposes that are repetitions of everything we've lived before. And I will close with that, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. And I thank you for your attention a lot.